Welcome. And in today's video, we're going to take a look at continuity planning, employee transition, employee turnover, whatever term you use to describe it. That's what we're essentially going to take a look at in today's video is how can we leverage Microsoft technologies and tools to improve our transition of employee knowledge whenever an employee either gets promoted or moves out of a position or switches their employment to a different corporation or company. How do we make sure that the next employee that takes over that position is up to speed as quickly as possible and ready to do that job? Because essentially all the time that it takes to get that employee trained results in lost productivity, maybe it's lost revenue. So it's very, very important to try to get employees trained and fulfilling the duties and responsibilities of their position as quickly as possible. Now, all of this video content really falls into the realm of knowledge management. Now, the discipline of knowledge management is one of the newer ones when you think about all the different business disciplines that are out there, whether it's safety or it's human resources. There are a lot of different disciplines. Knowledge management is kind of one of the new ones on the block. It's been around for a while, but it is still kind of the newer one, and a lot of businesses haven't necessarily fully embraced or understood how to use knowledge management or what knowledge management impacts, but it impacts a lot of the business realm, and it's very important to kind of put some focus on that. Now, for today's video, what are we talking about in the discipline of knowledge management? We're really just taking a look at knowledge conveyance. So it's essentially the transfer of knowledge between employees when an employee moves from this position to another position, or again, moves to a different organization and you have to hire somebody. How are we going to get that new employee up to speed on all of their duties and responsibilities as quickly as possible? Now, in terms of knowledge management, what are some of the things that knowledge management should address? Anything having to do with knowledge management, to include continuity planning, should address the roles, who's involved, what are the roles, the processes, the technologies, and the governance. And if we think about continuity planning, what are we talking about for roles? It really comes down to the manager and the employee. What are the processes? So essentially, how are we doing that process, and how are we going to get that employee up to speed, and then why are we doing the things that we're doing? What are the technologies? Now, this could be a custom platform for how you do it. Maybe it's just a training plan. Maybe it's a one-on-one training. A lot of your service industry relies heavily on one-on-one training, where maybe it's a server at a new restaurant and they kind of pair up with an existing knowledgeable employee and they kind of show them the ropes and kind of walk them through everything. And at the end of the process, they're expected to kind of be familiar with how to do everything and kind of be ready to go. And maybe that's the most effective approach for them. Sometimes you give them some reading materials and things to get more familiar with maybe the menu or what goes into the different menu items. So there are a lot of different ways, even in the service industry, where knowledge management is leveraged to ensure that that employee is ready to go as quickly as possible. And then in terms of technologies, for this video, we're going to focus primarily on Microsoft Teams, OneNote, OneDrive, the Microsoft ecosystem for this process. Now, in terms of governance, what are we talking about? That's essentially the policy, the metrics and incentives. Maybe it's the taxonomy, the level of support, where the support's coming from. So the governance can be a whole bunch of different things as well. So that's essentially how knowledge management relates to this. But the reason I'm bringing these things up in this way is that when you look at your process for continuity planning, employee transition, you want to look at it through those perspectives, the roles, the processes, the technologies, and the governance. And if you have any one of those areas that is lacking, you're probably going to have a broken overall process. So that's why it's important to kind of frame this through that perspective when you're looking at what processes and procedures you have in place for your continuity planning inside your organization. Now, before we go into Teams and kind of explain how you can use Teams for this process, let's go ahead and take a look at this resource I put together. Now, this is essentially kind of walking through explanation for continuity planning, knowledge transfer, the turnover process. And we can see here in terms of a process, essentially, a manager defines the process, the employee reviews, updates their continuity plan throughout the course of the reporting periods or their tenure with the organization or the position. And then the manager actually reviews that during the performance review, and the employee incorporates any noted changes or things that were missed. Maybe there's a new duty that was added and the employee needs to add that information. So this is essentially the cycle that I've determined should be probably put in place for effective turnover planning, continuity planning. And I'm going to emphasize this one here is in red. The manager defines the process. The only time you'll ever have continuity planning or the turnover planning process work effectively within an organization is if you have the manager taking the lead and setting the expectations for what should happen as part of this process. Whenever the manager hasn't bought into it or isn't involved, continuity planning typically doesn't take place. There might be an initial push to do this process, and then it kind of tails off at the end there, and then it gets kind of forgotten about until somebody else says, hey, why are our employees not doing well during their hiring process and they're taking forever to get up to speed? That's when you'll put more emphasis on this. So this kind of goes into governance, right? And who has what role and responsibility in this entire process. And I emphasize this because it's very important that this be kind of laid out and defined and that it be actually followed. So there's got to be some sort of a process in place. Now, I've got a military background in the military. The old days, we used to use the desktop turnover binders. We had all these binders all over the place. That was a very effective approach, and it was usually inspected as part of regular inspections. So maybe there's a phasmo inspection or logistic readiness inspection, or there's some other kind of inspection out there. And they take a look at all your processes for key billets, key functional areas on how the transition of knowledge is going to go to the next employee. That was very effective before we had a lot of these new technologies that are available. But essentially, that explains a way of doing governance. There's got to be some sort of a mechanism to make sure that it actually is followed. Otherwise, you are going to end up with outdated information or no information to present to that new employee and help them get up to speed as quickly as possible. And it will delay the productivity and potentially cost you revenue and income over the long haul. Now, there's some other things on here that are very helpful, so I'll just kind of scroll through here. Feel free to kind of pause and you can kind of read through this. When we talk about the continuity plan or the turnover plan, some of the key areas that we want to make sure that we kind of talk about are what are the reference materials for the job? Who are the people that you have to contact? What are the duties? What is the position description? Maybe some different types of reports that you have to do. What are the ongoing tasks that are currently being worked by that employee? Again, we don't always get to pick when our employees leave. Sometimes they pass away, sometimes they retire, and sometimes it's kind of short notice. Maybe there's a medical thing that pops up. So you don't always have a lot of time to prepare these things. And you got to build the processes to essentially account for that as well. And then you got your flowcharts or procedures and any kind of recommendations for training. Maybe there's a lot of training that goes into the position and it's not necessarily regularly understood that that is required for the position to be successful. So you would want to document all of that stuff as part of the process. All right. We've set a good groundwork for actually exploring this within the technology aspect. So let's go ahead and take a look at this inside of Microsoft Teams. Now, let's take a quick look at some of the previous, and I mentioned this already, but desktop binders, right? So we had all these desktop binders, and maybe you had one for your program or your functional area, or maybe your specific role in the company has a specific need for a turnover binder for your position, whatever the case is, but you had all these binders that were on your shelf behind you, and then when you left, the next person had all these binders. And that still can be a very effective approach, but that was before we had almost limitless storage capacity and we have these cloud storage options. So the next thing that kind of came around is, hey, we're going to create transition files. And essentially what it was a Word document. It had every element of the position right there, points of contact, references, training recommendations, the positions, all your daily, monthly, weekly task requirements are all laid out in there. And then you end up with a single file. And in this example here, we just have one file here, and maybe you have hundreds of folders or potentially thousands of files, and the next employee comes in and says, whoa, what is that? And they get overloaded. I'm sure that if you're watching this and you've been working for a while in sort of like an admin setting, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've got essentially thousands upon thousands of files. You have no idea where to even begin. So you just kind of go into shutdown mode and you'll just start over and kind of ignore everything that they gave you. And maybe you'll never find the continuity file or the transition file or the turnover file, which brings up another great point is everybody names these things differently. And unless there's kind of like a set thing for your corporation where you're going to call it a continuity plan or you're going to call it turnover, whatever you're going to name this thing, they're not going to know what to look for. And maybe the file isn't named what they're thinking and they don't know the different options for it and they're looking for turnover and maybe it's called in transition or maybe it's called continuity. So it becomes a real challenge just to find that one file. And then over the years, we decided that maybe folders are the better approach. So you end up with this continuity folder with a whole bunch of different breakdowns of all the different things, so all these different files. but you still end up with the exact same problem. You've got hundreds of folders and now you can't find that folder. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Files and folders inside of even Teams, inside of the file area here, works great. It's not the horrible way to do it, but it can be kind of a mess and it can be difficult for the employee to actually find what is relevant unless you've got very set policies across your corporation or your company on how these things are established, which is part of governance. So that is a benefit to do that. So this still is actually a pretty effective way to do it as long as you have some pretty good guardrails in there and managers are doing what they need to in terms of inspecting these and just kind of taking a look at everything to make sure that it is what they're looking for and that they can brief the next employee on where everything is and how to access everything. But it's still going to be a problem if you've got a lot of information in there where the employee is going to feel overloaded with information. And then we got the OneDrive. So this came up as well. Hey, we've got OneDrive now. We've got this cloud resource out there that we can use. And it has the exact same problem. It's a little bit easier to search, but essentially, which OneDrive? Are they put it on their personal OneDrive, or maybe they're saving it to their computer still, and like the old days where everything was just kind of stored in your My Documents, and all those files are lost when that employee transitions to a new position, or they move to a different job, or something else takes place where they move on from the company. Essentially, all of the information that that employee was working on is now lost because they were using their personal OneDrive. Because we've got these great tools for using our personal OneDrive. Now, fast forward to the Teams environment. So now we've essentially got the OneDrive equivalent, but it's collaborative. Everybody on the team can access it. So maybe Jen on our team needs access to a specific area because I'm on leave and they're covering down for me. She can now access all of my files inside of Teams. So Teams allows for essentially the management to take a look at it, but also your coworkers or potentially somebody that's going to cover down for you when you're gone. It's a great resource in that capacity. You can't necessarily do that with OneDrive. However, you can share OneDrive. So there are some things there that you could do to kind of make OneDrive work. But again, if you don't do that or your employees aren't trained on how to properly do that, they wouldn't necessarily know how to. So Teams is probably the better approach because you can collaborate and you have that redundancy. So should somebody have to take leave or go someplace. So we have our Teams folder here, and essentially this is where you would want to store all of your files across your team. And in terms of an individual, all of their working files. So you'll always have the most up-to-date information because they're only working here. Maybe they're still using OneDrive for something that's related to work, but it's not necessarily a specific thing that needs to be shared. Maybe it's images for SharePoint development, although I would argue that should also be in there. Maybe it's all the coding related to something. Maybe it's a contractor position and that's a proprietary information. It can't be shared. That would be something that maybe would go into OneDrive. But the vast majority of working files these days should just be right inside a team, so all the employees have access to it. Essentially, the company is paying you to create this content, these different documents, and the company should have access to that material, so it should be in an area where everybody can access it. If I had my way, I would probably get rid of the personal OneDrive entirely because again, the company's paying for everything that you're doing. So there shouldn't be anything that you don't feel comfortable sharing inside of the team space. Maybe there's some sensitive information in terms of like social security numbers and that kind of stuff. That's probably a good example. But even that, I might say just put it in a restricted access folder. SharePoint is capable of storing that kind of information. You just got to be careful with how it's being stored, put the proper permissions and maybe a login password and that kind of stuff on it. So you can limit even that kind of content. So if I'm making an argument for why maybe you shouldn't be using your personal OneDrive, I hope so, because that is kind of the case. You really should just kind of use Teams for pretty much your entire work portfolio. That way, whatever you're working on now does get transferred to that next employee and they can kind of resume wherever you left off. So now how do we set up our team space to work with that? So let's go ahead and create a new folder. And I like to do a number format. So essentially you've got numbers in front of all your folders. So they keep in a specific organizational design. So I usually start with 1 and we'll go ahead and add personnel sandbox. And we can also change the color here. So this could be just kind of a light pink. So we'll set that and we'll go ahead and create this folder. And all of your personnel have a folder in here. So we'll go ahead and add a couple of folders and we'll say, well, Travis is an employee here and his color might be red. So that's going to be his assigned color. Everything's going to use that color moving forward. And then maybe we've got another employee named Anna, so we'll go ahead and create a folder for her. And instead of red, we're going to go with this color here. And then we've got essentially two folders here. And all of our employees have this. All of our employees can access this information. So that's, again, why I would keep teams to a team level instead of saying like the entire organization has a team. I would just kind of keep it at a smaller team element. And I did a video on how to use teams and some processes from a business perspective. Go ahead and check out that video here if you want to see some ideas for how you could organize your teams. But let's say that that's essentially how we're doing this. Now, inside of here, we would put all of our working files. And you might say, well, this has the same problem that I just described earlier. It's going to get lost. There's going to be a whole bunch of different things in there. They're not going to find the turnover file. Well, this is just the raw data as far as like files that we're talking about. So all of our files and folders will be here, not necessarily our actual transition or turnover plan are going to be in here. So let's go ahead and back out here. So now we've got essentially, hey, these are maybe all the files and folders related to the entire team. Maybe they're templates and that kind of stuff. And then you got your personnel sandbox, and this is where the employees work. All of their materials in here. Now, maybe you've got some shared programs or functional areas. Maybe that shared program or functional area goes out here instead of inside of their personnel folder. So maybe you've got somebody that's doing purchases and you've got an accounts department. Well, maybe that's a specific functional area or a program area and you want to have multiple employees assigned to that. So essentially you would create another folder out here, and maybe that's called 2, and we'll say that is Power Apps development. Maybe we have a whole bunch of different developers that do Power Apps stuff. And maybe the lead is Travis. So we'll go ahead and put red because this is his area. He's the lead for it. If we go back to the personnel sandbox, we saw we put this color here for Travis, and we can associate this color as being his areas. And then we can kind of organize these and try to group them together so that anything that belongs to Travis is essentially in one block of color. So you would see this long list of this color, and then you would see Anna's color and all of her areas. And then you can kind of break it up that way. And the numbers keep things kind of organized. You can always add another number, or maybe you use decimals, so you go 2.1, 2.2, maybe it's a related area. You have a lot of different flexibility on how you set this up. But the key thing is as a manager, you go through and you've got all of your employee content right here. All of the programs or functions that they do within the organization are listed down here. And you can very easily kind of walk through the employee during maybe, say, a performance review or some sort of a regular update that you sit down and talk with your employees and kind of see what they're doing. And you can kind of sit down and walk through all this with them. Again, that's the processes and governance aspect, as well as you're talking about the roles. And we're obviously going through some of the technology. So you can kind of see how all of this kind of works together to build our plan. All right, so that's files and folders and essentially all of that working product that our employees have. What about the actual information that needs to be transitioned to the next employee beyond just the files and the folders? Well, for that, we're going to leverage our little tab up here called Continuity Plan. Now, this is OneNote, and OneNote is a fantastic tool for this particular process. Now let's go ahead and expand this and see what we got here. So again, we got all the employees listed down here. And then if we look at Travis here specifically, Travis is proactive and got everything into there, his continuity plan here. So he's got essentially, how do I maintain this? I'm the person that did this last, so I'm gonna put my name in there. And then kind of, if you break the link or maybe you change the document location, you copy everything over to your area maybe, but then you get duplicate files. So I'm not sure if that's a good way to do it, but these are the kinds of things you want to think through is, hey, what about that replacement employee? What do we do with other files? And then this kind of explains, you might want to think about that. And then their duties and all the points of contact, reference material. And then you can actually go in here and list out all the different SharePoint portals. Maybe he's in charge of all your SharePoint stuff, so you can list all that stuff in here. And then you want to give examples of, okay, how do I update this? And you can actually put images in here. You can put videos. You can put a whole bunch of different things inside of OneNote that make this a great tool for continuity plan or for that transition plan. And it doesn't get cluttered. Now, this might have, depending on the number of duties this employee has, it might have a lot of different tabs in here. And actually, you can make these into collapsible also if you want to do something like that. So again, this is a great way to build that turnover plan because it's not going to get lost in a sea of files. The name's right there. You tell the new employee, hey, you're taking over for Travis, who was the previous person. Here's where you go, and you actually, as a manager, show them where OneNote is once they get access to your technology. and you can log into your computer systems and see all this stuff, and you just show it to them. You say, hey, here's all the stuff. And when you click on the duties, you can see maybe you're the SharePoint person, maybe you're in charge of all the Microsoft Teams and all the Power Apps, and then you're also doing some of the integrations between SharePoint Online and Teams, and maybe the duties are getting longer and longer as more employees change over or the company takes off. But essentially, you can sit down with the employee and kind of walk them through some of the core elements here. Hey, points of contact. And then when you're doing those annual reviews or maybe that mid-cycle review with the employee and you're just checking to make sure everything's updated, you're looking through the points of contact and you're like, well, hey, didn't that person leave? And you can identify some necessary updates and you kind of work together between the manager and the employee to make sure that this information is updated. Again, this is more important to the manager and the organization and the business than it is to the employee. Given to their own devices, the employee will never do anything in here because it's not necessarily time well spent in terms of completing their tasks every day. Where it really leverages and is beneficial is when that employee leaves and the next person is here. The manager will definitely realize the issue when that employee has no idea what they're supposed to be doing, and maybe the manager had a good understanding, but not necessarily all the specifics, and all the specifics were lost because there wasn't a good transition plan. So you can kind of see how this approach works great for making things easy to find, especially if your team isn't more than, say, 10 to 15 people. If you keep your teams created at a much higher level, so for example, maybe you're at a division and there's like 100 people, this could get kind of busy. So again, one of the reasons why I recommend doing these teams at a lower level, say at an actual team size or a office size, maybe there's like 8 to 10 people in an office, then that would essentially be your team construct for building these. But again, I covered that in the other video pretty extensively, so check that out. Now, this is great for the employees, but remember in our files and folders area, we talked about program areas and functional areas. You can do the same thing here. So let's go ahead and create a program area. And again, we'll just do the same thing we just did in the files and folders to keep everything aligned. We'll just say Power App Development for the name of this folder. And again, we can go into here and we can organize this right with the person, or we can move them to the bottom. We can do kind of whatever we want there. And let's go ahead and drag this out. Now we can also change the colors, right? So we can make the colors align with the employee because the employer for this is the program manager for Power App Development. And then all the employees that work with Travis on Power App Development have access to everything that's in here for maybe there's process and procedures, maybe there's a bunch of components that you're supposed to use, and there's some additional guidance for how to kind of set those up. And you can kind of build out all of the information necessary for a team to essentially work on different projects or different functional areas within OneNote. And this turns into your one-stop shop for everything on how that team functions. Now, that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover in this video on continuity planning. Hopefully you found the video helpful. Until next time.